Thank you. I wish to welcome my two distinguished panelists, Richard Haass, who was former director of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is today with Centerview Partners, and Dr. Jacques Attali, head of Attali Associates. Has written an astounding 88 books, and he, at the same time, I think, does symphonies as well as predicts the future, which is, whether we like it or not, where we're going to be spending the rest of our lives. So we have done, to answer this question, before we discuss it, we have done, for the Harris poll, which is part of Stagwell, we have done a survey of 100 global CEOs. And we asked them, will this election have impact on the global economy? 77% said they would have impact on the global economy, and what they were particularly concerned about were changes in immigration policy, impact on international trade relations, economic stability, as the critical factors that they think can be determined by the outcome of this election. And we asked a very similar question. Do US CEOs favor Trump on who will boost the economy, or Harris? So it was quite interesting. If you look at US CEOs, 52% said Trump, 15% said Harris, about the same said both equally. When you take out the US CEOs, global CEOs were 35% Harris would be better for the global economy, 30% Trump, and then both equally. So quite a split between the non-US CEOs, who are primarily, if I look at the sample of large CEOs in China, if I were going to take a look at where they came from, some from this region, obviously some from Europe, compared to the US. So with those findings in mind, we will turn to our distinguished advisors and maybe start with Richard. What do you think of the reaction, both in this room and in US CEOs, that they believe that Donald Trump will boost the global economy?
Well, I thought the reaction in this room, which was about 2-to-1 in favor of Mr. Trump for his likely impact on the global economy, and then you had the US CEOs far more supportive of Mr. Trump. My reaction to that is history is often about individuals and countries not acting in their own self-interest. And I think what we've just seen is a vote of American CEOs against their own self-interest. The next president of the United States, whoever it is, will inherit an American economy that's one of the strongest in the world, against a very large base, growing in the area of 3% or so, 3.5%. Inflation has come down dramatically. Jobs are at something of a high. So the United States economy is in good shape. And traditionally, when you think about transitions, the first piece of advice for any incoming CEO, and the president is the CEO of the United States, you would say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, or don't fix it more than it's broken. It's not perfect, but don't fix it more than it's broken. So I think if you had Kamala Harris, by and large, you would have much more continuity than change. But I think if you have Donald Trump, you would have tariffs introduced across the board, particularly high against China, but tariffs against everyone, which would be inflationary and potentially cause something of a trade war. The idea that we could introduce tariffs and not have retaliation is a fantasy. The pressure against, strong pressures on immigrants, particularly if deportation were ever to happen, would raise the unit costs of labor, again would be wildly inflationary. So what you would have is the Federal Reserve, rather than continuing to lower interest rates, which I think would happen if you had a President Harris, would suddenly come under pressure to raise interest rates, particularly given the reduction in taxation. That would be a centerpiece of the Trump administration. So it's quite possible that a year after Donald Trump were elected, you would have something of a trade war, plus you would have renewed inflation, plus you would have fundamental questions about the independence of the American Federal Reserve, all of which leads me to be surprised that a preponderance of American CEOs would see it in their interest to have such a dramatic change when, again, the status quo from their point of view should be pretty good. 10 more seconds. The last I checked, The stock market's at something of an all-time high. That means their companies are doing rather well. So I find it odd, this bias for change in a context where they're doing well and the economy is doing well. I find it hard to explain on the merits.
Well, it sounds, Richard, like the U.S. CEOs will need some of your advice.
They can have it.
Yes. So Jacques, particularly the Chinese CEOs did not want Trump. What do you think is going on there?
Well, unfortunately, I agree with what Richard said. Therefore, we are not competing and dialoguing, more trying to add to what he said. I will first say that's true. The American economy is strong, but it's very weak on another side. Because there is a figure that has not been discussed, is the American public debt, which is higher since the end of the Second World War. America is bankrupt. America is bankrupt. Repeat it, it's a fact. And if after 1945, the country could have been successful in swallowing the debt, which was 116% down to 20%, because we have a huge growth. Growth today and in the next decade, whatever happened, cannot swallow a debt of 125%. It's not, I don't know, but it seems impossible. Therefore, there are many solutions. First, one will be seen in January, even before the inauguration, which is the debt ceiling, which is to be addressed in January. And after, if the debt ceiling is once again postponed, that means that the American debt is going to balloon, and at a certain moment, something happens. It can be inflation, it can be bankruptcy, many scenarios are possible. Whoever is president, the world economy is facing the fact that the American economy, the strongest economy in the world, with a single strong currency, is bankrupt. That's a fact. There are many potentials way out, but it's a fact. And maybe it's a reason why the Chinese prefer Trump, because they think of the Chinese interest, not of the world.
It could be that the Chinese CEOs do not want those tariffs against
Sorry?
It could be that those Chinese CEOs do not want those tariffs on their products.
Of course, we don't want nobody, because the tariffs are for Chinese, but are also for Europeans. Lower, but they are 20%. And that's, of course, and as Richard said, it would be not without any consequences. It's clear, no one knowing something in economy can say that this will not have negative consequences on growth. Tariff will weaken growth. And if we weaken growth, you even weaken the capacity of dealing with debt, because growth is the only safe way to get out of debt. Then if you weaken growth, you worsen the situation of the American public debt and the situation of the dollar, and a huge amount of catastrophe are possible.
So Richard,
And it has not been an issue in any of the American debate in the last weeks.
Correct. Now, Richard, as the debt has increased, the dollar has strengthened. So even though Jacques says the U.S. economy is bankrupt, as you say, the stock market is at an all-time high, the dollar is strengthening. Like, what is going on here?
Well, an American economist, public official Herbert Kahn once said that which can't go on forever won't. So the debt is not a problem until the day that it is. And the problem with the debt is it's a slow motion crisis. And it's very hard for political systems, particularly democratic political systems, to react to slow motion crises. Climate change is another example of that. So the debt we will live with. It'll expand at a much faster rate under Donald Trump than it would under Kamala Harris, because the tax cuts cannot be offset by spending cuts. You simply don't have the possibility.
Elon Musk says he's going to cut $2 trillion out.
Well, there's two things that are wrong with that. One is if you take entitlements off the table, you have to service your debt, and you're not going to slash defense. The amount of discretionary spending you have to cut is marginal. So this idea that there's all this waste and fraud and abuse in the U.S. government, it's a slogan, but it's not serious economics. It's not serious economic policy. So you would have to assume The debt will go up under either president, let me just make that clear, but it would probably go up at least a factor of 2 under Donald Trump, given the combination, more than anything, of tax cuts and some of the other policies we were talking about, inflation and so forth, that it could actually, and the protectionism, that could actually reduce the rate of economic growth. So, you only have 3 ways to get out of debt: slash spending, increase taxes, or grow. And what I'm worried about is we're going to end up mainly looking at really none of them. We're not going to grow under a Trump administration if that is to happen. We'll grow at a much lower rate, to be more specific. Spending will not be cut significant, but taxes will. So the situation could well be exacerbated.
Well, Jacques, the number one issue that CEOs were concerned about was inflation, followed by immigration, followed by energy prices. If you can, as a futurologist, give us what you think the future of inflation is going to be in the global economy in the next few years.
If you look at the history of public debt worldwide, there are not a lot of ways to get out of public debt. One is growth, as I said before. The second is taxes. The third is inflation. And that means that if we don't use that, we will have inflation to diminish the debt. Or the last solution is war. Because when you have war, you can easily ruin the lenders by saying, okay, you lend me money, but forget about it, it's a tax. And inflation is a kind of also a way of taxing the lenders. But I think there is difficulty to imagine that inflation will not come back.
Okay, and Richard, we just have probably a minute or so, but energy prices. What do you think about the global situation and how this election will affect energy prices?
Look,
Drill, baby, drill, or?
The United States is already the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, so we can drill, I guess, somewhat more, but the fundamentals are already there. Demand for hydrocarbons is staying high because demand for energy is going up. We're making greater use of alternatives, and we're making greater use of hydrocarbons. Prices of energy right now are low, particularly if you adjust them for inflation. They'll go up and down depending upon global demand, and they'll go up and down depending upon instability in the Middle East. Short of a major war, though, with Iran that involves potentially the kingdom and other places, I don't think, though, the Middle East will have a significant effect on energy prices. So the real question there is what happens in this part of the world, and I would simply say recent events, both in April and last week, show at least the possibility that Israel and Iran are able not to solve their differences, shall we say, but at least to manage them in a way that doesn't necessarily trigger an all-out regional war.
Well, let me say in wrapping up, when you look at the impact of this election, obviously trade policy, China CEOs were concerned about it. US CEOs were welcoming it. Immigration policy will fundamentally change if Trump is elected because it will close the border, and there were 10 million new US residents who have come in. And energy prices may be affected because if it is President Trump, he wants to drill considerably more to keep prices down, whereas Harris is going to put into impact more climate change friendly policies, which may bring energy prices up. So I think either way, certainly the CEOs said on the one hand, Trump was better for the global economy. Our advisors say the opposite. The Trump economy will not be a good one. We will see very shortly the outcome of this election, and then how the market reacts, and then the reality of how the economy then changes as a result of these vast differences in policy that will be implemented based on its outcome. Thank you all very much.